We're live.
Hello, everywhere that you are. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. My name is Judy Villeneuve-Dice. I am with Education Solutions International, and we are very excited about our program today. And thank you for joining us. We are Education Solutions International. We are a nonprofit in existence since January of 2022. And we've had the opportunity to meet a selection of incredible people in the work that we do. The work that we do primarily focuses in the diaspora of Jamaica and the islands in general. We are advocating and supporting everyone that's doing education in every capacity, especially in leadership and in, of course, distribution of scholarships and other opportunities, and just bringing our education community together. So it's very exciting because we want to make sure that in the work that we do, education on every level that affects children is our primary focus. So today, we are joined by two very quintessential experts in their area, the areas of child labor, human trafficking, and modern day slavery. So before further ado, I'm going to have our CEO, Dr. Dwayne Dice, do a brief introduction and greeting before we move to our individual speakers.
All right, thank you. Thank you very much, Mrs. Dice. Welcome, everyone. I'm very happy to be here, like all of you. I'm the CEO, the founder and CEO of Education Solutions International, and I am super excited to learn more about this topic. Our very abled presenters are here with us, and we're in collaboration with them to present this topic to you. Now, as you listen, make sure that you have your questions ready, and also you have a notebook or some form of media so you can take notes, as well as jot down anything that you want to research later on, because it is to bring awareness to human trafficking, child labor, and modern slavery. It's very important that we understand these concepts so that when we see them in our society, we can identify them, and also to try to put a stop to it. Literally, that's what it means, to stop doing it and to help people to stop doing these things. So welcome, everyone. And I'm very happy to be here, just like you, to learn more about this topic and bring awareness. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Dice. And for those of you who are joining us for the first time, welcome. Education Solutions International is online. You can find out more about the work that we do at educationsolutionsinternational.org, and our presence on YouTube. Make sure that you subscribe, because as very informative events like this take place, you'll be notified when we go live, which we are right now. So we are going to have first our panelist, Matthew Friedman. He's the CEO of Mekong Club. He's an expert and author on modern day slavery. And then following our brief conversation with Matthew, we're going to be speaking with Shira Mensari. She's the founder and CEO of I Am Somebody's Child Soldier. And her area of expertise, of course, is child labor and human trafficking. And you can see how these two topics overlap. So we're very excited to begin. And please welcome Matthew Friedman. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that introduction, and I'm thrilled to be here today. In the short time that I have, I'm going to talk a little bit about what is human trafficking. I'm going to talk about how this particular issue is associated with the private sector, because that's kind of where I work, and then talk about what the private sector is doing, and then some closing remarks. But to begin with, we can't start a talk related to this particular topic without having some cases. You know, when most people think about human trafficking, they think about the photo in the top left-hand corner. For good reason. There are 6.3 million women and girls in forced prostitution around the world. My first exposure to this was 35 years ago. I was living and working in Nepal. We were finding girls that were 12, 13 years old who were HIV positive, couldn't understand what was going on. So we went to go and interview them, and we heard the same story over and over again. It went something like this. Human trafficker would go into a village, say that he's looking for a wife. He didn't want an urban wife. He wants a rural wife. He'd find a girl 12 years old, go to the family, say, I'd like to marry her. After a couple of days, they actually have a wedding ceremony. After that, he goes to the family and says, well, I'm going to take your daughter to Kathmandu, but don't worry, I'll be back in 3 months. But that's not what's going to happen. He takes her to Mumbai, India, to the red light district where the brothels. He sells her there. And then we've heard the stories over and over again. She will eventually be used by 20 guys a day, every day for a couple of years until she's completely burnt out emotionally, spiritually, physically, and nobody wants her. This happens all over the world. This is what most people know, but it's not just women and girls, it's men and boys. Top right-hand photo is a fishing boat. Story behind this, 15-year-old boy is told that he has to go to Thailand to get a job to support his family. He is told that he can go on a fishing boat. Initially, they say the boat will go out for a couple of months. You'll come back, you'll have money in your pocket, but that's not what's going to happen. The boat will go out for 4 years. This poor kid will end up working 14, 15 hours a day, every day. If he doesn't, he gets beaten, he gets tortured. The only food he'll eat the entire time he's there is rice and fish. If he gets sick, if he gets injured, they throw him off the side of the boat. At the end of the 4 years, he gets nothing. Bottom center photo, I worked for the United Nations for a number of years. We would do raids and rescues. And we would find factories where kind of a person from Myanmar goes to Thailand, hears that there's work in a place called Summit Sakan, where they have a lot of seafood packing company. He knocks on the door, factory owner comes out and says, what do you need? I'm looking for a job. Factory owner says, okay, I'll give you a job. I'll pay you the equivalent of $50 US, but you can't leave the factory. You got to stay in the factory. This person's never made more than $25. He's thrilled. He goes into the factory, works under horrendous conditions, but at least he knows that he can send money home. After a couple of months, he goes to the factory manager, says, I'd like to be paid. Factory manager says, well, I forgot to mention one thing. For you to be here, it costs $54 US. I'm only paying you $50. And guess what? You owe me money and you can't leave until you pay it back. So you have a person who languishes in a situation where every day they work, they get deeper and deeper in debt. These are just a couple of examples of what we're talking about. When we're talking about the number of people in this situation, 6 months ago, the number was 40 million, but it went up to 50 million because of COVID. Post-COVID, you have a lot of people who are in desperate situation. Let's say in Bangladesh, you had a girl, she was working in a garment factory, was happy with her work. All of a sudden, woman, I should say, all of a sudden COVID hits and she loses her job, not for a couple of weeks or months, but for years. She goes through her savings. She doesn't have any money. She borrows money. After that, she can't pay it back. Traffickers come and say, well, if you can't pay the money back, I need a family member. They're going to go off to a brothel or a fishing boat or a sweatshop. And so as a result of that, we see a significant increase in people who are in these situations. In Africa and other parts of the world, you see that the numbers are quite high. This happened to be for an Africa presentation. That's why I'm highlighting it. But I usually live in Asia, and 55% of the people in this part of the world are in modern slavery circumstances, basically for two reasons. Number one, there's a lot of people in Asia. China, 1.4 billion people. India, 1.4 billion. And then you have Pakistan and Japan and the Philippines, and all these other countries have huge population sizes. The other thing is the feudal systems in this part of the world never been completely dismantled. As a result of that, you have literally millions and millions of people in what's called modern slavery. The exploitation rate is the rate at which people are kind of put into this situation. In a year, about 9.2 million people in a day around the world, 25,200 people enter modern slavery. Just imagine that. It could be anywhere in the world. Every 4 seconds, you have a person entering to modern slavery. So if you count to 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, somewhere in the world, somebody enters into modern slavery. Could be in Africa, could be in Asia, could be in North America. And the drum beats on and on and on and on. The people who are supposed to address this issue are governments. I've worked with over 40 governments around the world. Governments really don't like this topic. It's confusing, it's time consuming. They don't really know what to do with the victims and so forth. So many governments do things, but usually not enough to have a significant impact. When it comes to the United Nations, I worked for the UN for 6 years. I ran the largest counter-trafficking program in the world for a while. But, the difficulty with the United Nations is we spend a lot of time in 5-star hotels eating really good food, debating and discussing theoretical aspects related to human trafficking. So it's really the NGOs that are doing the lion's share of the work. They're the ones that are out there day in and day out trying to prevent this from taking place. But there's another group that needs to be involved. out of modern slavery, 75% of the victims are forced labor victims, and 60% of them are associated with supply chains, where we get our clothes, our fish, our electronics, our shoes, and so forth. So the private sector needs to be involved in this. But if you think governments don't like this topic, the private sector hates it because they're often on the receiving end of somebody wagging a finger and saying it's because of the private sector that we have modern slavery. And to a certain extent, that's true. But there are a lot of companies that are trying to be responsible to ensure that, in fact, they don't have modern slavery within their supply chains. And I'll talk about that in a few minutes. So what I'm going to show you now is the report card for the number of people who were helped out of modern slavery last year out of the 50 million people. And I'm going to show you out of 500,000 criminals, how many of them actually went to jail. And these are the numbers. Last year, out of 50 million, it was about 108,000, 0.2%, not even 0.5%. Out of 500,000 criminals, about 9,000 of them, or 0.8%. When you look at this, you might ask the question, does the counter trafficking world not care? Are they lazy? Why are these numbers so low? That's not the issue, because when you talk to people who work in this sector, they desperately want to do something to help. The issue is this: the profits generated from modern slavery, 150 billion US dollars a year, second only to drug trafficking, which is about 300 billion. The amount of money globally to fight this is about 350 million annually, which is 0.23% of the profits. To put this number into perspective, in the United States, we eat $6 billion worth of potato chips. It takes 21 days of potato chip eating to come up with the equivalent amount of money that's used to fight modern slavery around the world. You can see what it is we're up against. Another thing is the scale. The number of people that do the work that we do is about 30,000 people around the world. Against 500,000 greed incentivized criminals, we have to follow rules and regulations. We have to do donor reports. We have to do fundraising. If they find anyone getting close to them, mutate, evolve, change, hurt somebody, whatever it takes to get out of that situation. And lastly, awareness raising related to human trafficking is so low. Very few people know about human trafficking. And if you don't know about an issue, you're not going to care. If you don't care, you're not going to do anything. So this is kind of just a quick overview of some of the things related to modern slavery and human trafficking that we need to know. So I run an organization that works with corporations to help them to understand the issue of human trafficking. And people might ask the questions, why would corporations be involved in addressing this? And a lot of it really comes down to that figure of 0.2%. When governments came to realize that the NGOs and the United Nations and the governments really weren't hitting even 1%, and at the same time, the business world had supply chains, and supply chains are associated with forced labor, they said, we got to bring the business world into the fight. And so what they did is they changed a bunch of things around to create kind of a business risk to draw the business world into this situation. So I'm going to go through some of the trends that we're seeing over time. The first trend deals with legislation. So prior to 2012, you didn't have much legislation related to private companies as it related to modern slavery. What would happen is now and then the governments and the United Nations and the NGOs would get together and talk about modern slavery, and then a report would come out and everyone would be encouraged to kind of read the report, or there would be an ILO convention or something. Many of these things, excellent work, excellent information, but they weren't binding. There was no kind of legislative requirement that companies follow this. So it wasn't until 2012. In 2012, you had the California Transparency and Supply Chain Act that came out. This act basically said, if you are a company and you have any products in California and you make profits of $100 million in either retail or manufacturing, you got to put in your website what you're doing to address modern slavery. If you're not doing anything at all, and you say that, you're in compliance, but you have to say something. This legislation is set aside to allow for consumers to determine whether companies are doing things or not. A couple of years later, the kind of UK Modern Slavery Act came. It lowered it from 100 million to 36 million pounds, but then they had an annual report. It's about 20 pages that every big company has to fill out that talks about modern slavery, and that report has to be signed by the board of directors. Then you had the French Act and the Australian Act and the EU Act and the German Act. With each of these acts, they add additional factors, additional things. And so as a result of this, companies have to care about this. Companies have to do things. And if they don't, bad things happen to them. Another thing we're seeing is that companies are being sued for things that happen within their supply chain. For example, large retail companies go to Thailand and they buy seafood. And the plaintiffs are saying, because you're buying seafood that's tainted by modern slavery, you're supporting modern slavery. You have to use your influence to ensure that that doesn't happen. Now, many of these companies don't have the influence to change that system, but what happens is these lawsuits make their way into the newspapers or on the television, and this creates a naming and shaming situation for these companies. It becomes a real embarrassment for them, and it affects their business. The chocolate industry is often sued because, as we all know, in certain locations in Africa, you have child labor that takes place, where a lot of children are in forced labor type circumstances. When the chocolate companies get sued, this creates a problem because they want chocolate to be associated with Valentine's Day and Easter and love and affection and, all of those types of things. And so these types of lawsuits create a real difficult situation for private companies. Another thing we see is a significant increase in media coverage associated with modern slavery, almost a doubling every year for the past 10 years. The more information that's out there, the more appetite that consumers have for this information. And as a result of this, this leads to a lot of companies being named and shamed. So this creates problems for companies. Lastly, ESG. Now, many of us who are NGO workers know what the SDGs are, the sustainability goals. They're the goals that the world use, the governments use in order to identify how to do good in the world. There's 17 of them. But the private sector has its own version of this. It's called ESG. E is environment, G is governance, and S is social. And so big companies will identify indicators within these categories, and then they give scores to those indicators. And if the scores are positive, basically investors will invest in them. Post-COVID, now consumers want this information. And so what this means is that big companies will eventually have to fill out these indicators, and it will create the equivalent of a naughty and a nice list. The naughty list will be companies that don't file ESG, companies that don't have high scores, and the nice list will be those who have ESG and good scores. And as a result of that, this offers a lot of pressure for companies. So this is the reason why companies are now stepping up and getting involved in addressing modern slavery. The reason for this is that people care about this. Millennials all over the world basically care about whether companies are doing right by the world. A recent study identified that 84% of them would buy things based on ESG. And these same individuals will eventually be translating into the fund managers of the big mutual funds around the world over time. And so this is another relevant reason for this. So what I'm going to do now is just talk a little bit about manufacturing companies. Manufacturing companies have what are called supply chains. This is where items are made. So let's say that we're talking about a running shoe. So let's say it's one of the big running shoe companies. They would have 3 tiers in their supply chain. Tier 1 is where they assemble the running shoe. All the pieces come together there. That particular tier has been audited for the last 25 years. Nobody finds issues at that level, but where the shoelaces and the zippers and the rivets and the sole and the textile comes from, nobody's ever audited those factories. Nobody's ever asked them to audit it, or the raw material, the brass, the metal, the wool, the rubber, the cotton, and so forth. The legislation now says that companies have to go all the way down into their supply chains. So that means that, let's say that a running shoe company was auditing 2,000 companies, tier 1 companies, and all of a sudden they have to put tier 2 and 3, that's 10,000 audits. Who's going to pay for that? Will your running shoe go from $50 to $100? And so you're seeing a change where competitors are coming together and sharing information. We're using the same zipper company. We'll do zippers, you do rivets, somebody else do this. And so this rationalization process is taking place to keep the prices down. So what are they looking for when they do these audits? Well, basically, there are 11 indicators of what's called modern slavery. And so what the auditors are looking for are some of these indicators. Let me give you an example. So let's say that there's an employee, a Nepalese kind of villager, and he's making about $50 a month in the village, not enough to really live on in that situation. A recruitment agent comes in and says, well, how would you like to make $250? Wow, that sounds great. What do I need to do? Well, you need to come with me to the capital, Kathmandu. We'll get a passport for you. We'll train you. We'll basically get the plane tickets. We'll send you to Malaysia, and you're going to make that money. Oh, but you also have to give us 1,500 US dollars. I don't have $1,500. We'll lend it to you. Somebody will give it. Don't worry about it. So he signs an agreement, not realizing that agreement has all kinds of interest and fees and everything else. So by the time he gets to Kathmandu, $1,500 is $3,000. By the time he gets to Malaysia, it's $4,500. So by the time when he gets to Malaysia, he ends up spending a year or two just to pay back the money he borrowed. No money's going home. He was making at least $50 a month. Now no money is going back. This is called debt bondage. This is an indicator that the audits are looking for. Another thing you see is contract substitution. You have a person who signs a contract in Nepalese. He knows what he's supposed to be paid. When he gets to Malaysia, they say, sign this agreement. He looks at it. It's in a language he doesn't understand it. They say, sign it. No, I can't. You sign it. We'll send you back. You lose everything. So he signs this. That contract cheats him out of additional fees. There's penalties, targets, and so forth. So he's not actually making $250. He's actually making $125. And that money has to be to pay back the debt. When he gets off the plane, they take his passport. They basically say, well, you can't leave here in this particular situation because you said you were going to be here for 4 years. So if the guy says after 2 years, I want to go home, they won't give the passport back. By holding the passport, it becomes leverage for him basically being in a situation where he's held in place. So these are the types of indicators that they're basically looking for. In order to address these issues, big companies around the world are changing their policies. They're stepping up. They're doing things that they didn't do before. One of the things they're doing is putting policies in place that say we have zero tolerance related to human trafficking. And all of their agreements, all the way down their supply chain, basically say the same thing. They're training everybody. I do a lot of training for big brands. I do training for their suppliers and their sub-suppliers to help those organizations know what their rights are, what they need to do, how they need to protect themselves. Audits are becoming more sophisticated, which means that instead of just going on the factory floor and spending a couple of minutes and looking around to see if it looks okay, they're really finding ways of talking to the workers, getting their story, identifying if there's any of these issues. And as a result of that, that's really helping them to identify whether there are problems. They have a responsible recruitment process, which means that if one of these big companies goes to a factory and says to them, do you have any of those people who are indebted, who have debt? You do? Okay, we can't work with you, or you have to pay that debt back, because that indebtedness, once again, holds those people in place. And lastly, there's a lot more emphasis on grievance mechanisms and basically identifying worker voices, what workers are doing, and so forth. So the organization that I run is called the Mekong Club. We are based in Hong Kong. We work all over the world. And we work with the private sector in a positive, supportive, non-naming and shaming way. And we do this because we recognize, based on the criteria that I explained to you, that these companies need to understand this issue, but they don't know who to go to, so they go to us. So we work with the banks, we work with the retailers, the manufacturers, the hospitality sector. And for each of these sectors, we basically give them a baseline. We figure out where they are in their journey. We train them. We give them consultation. We give them access to tools so that they, as big companies, can address this. You might ask, why would the banks be interested in this? $150 billion generated from illegal activities. If any of that money gets into a bank, it's money laundering. They get fined. There was a bank in Australia that was fined 1.3 billion Australian dollars. Why the hospitality sector? They have sex trafficking issues. They have construction issues. They have third-party contracts of worker issues, and they have supply chains. And so we work with all of them. I'm going to just end with a story because it puts into perspective what I think really needs to happen here related to human trafficking. So 30 years ago, when I was in Nepal, I desperately wanted to do something to address human trafficking. So I decided I was going to write a book. As part of this book project, I went from shelter to interview the women and girls. I went to one shelter and there was a girl named Geeta. And every time I approached her, she said, no, I don't want to talk to you. But she sat and listened to all the other stories. When I finished and I was leaving, Geeta comes running up and says, I changed my mind. You can have my story. So Gita sat on one side of the table, the rest of us on the other side of the table. And over a 3-hour period, she just told the worst story of rape and torture and disease and betrayal and murder. I honestly didn't know what to say to her. Finally, I turned to Gita and I said, wow, Gita, you must be so angry at the traffickers for the horrific things they did to you. She paused, and then she said, no, I'm angry at you and you and you. She pointed at us. She said, where were you? Said that every day she woke up praying for somebody to come and help. Nobody came. Said she went to school till she was 12. She knew that everything out there was right out in the open. Nobody was doing anything. She said she wasn't angry at the traffickers. She said they're just bad people being bad people. She said she was angry at the good people, at society for allowing a 15-year-old girl to be commercially raped 7,000 times only to eventually get AIDS and she was dying. Now, I tell the story because she was calling us all out. She understood that the 30,000 of us around the world were only reaching less than 0.5%. The only way this issue is going to go away is that we as human beings around the world wake up to the fact that this is happening, 25,200 people entering per day. This is unreasonable. This is unfair. This is unjust. Everything you can imagine that is bad is associated with this. This has to stop. We have to collectively as a world come to that conclusion and do something. Lastly, there's a couple of books that we sell in order to raise money to address modern slavery. One of them deals with volunteerism, be the hero, be the change. The other one deals with human trafficking and what needs to be done to address it. With that, thank you very much. I'll stop there.
Well, thank you so much. Obviously, that was incredibly informative, and I'm touched by these stories. And I think the takeaway for me from the last point that you made is that nothing is more harmful than society's apathy for these situations, and we're going up against economic principles when it comes to what incentivizes us, a cheap deal, a product that's on sale, and we don't think of the fact that it's on sale because the cost of creating it is lower, so that the expense of purchasing it is going to be lower, and we don't really see the human accountability and the impact that that kind of decision is going to make. If you don't mind just saying those two books again, I'm sure the educators on the call would be very interested. Just say it one more time.
Be the hero, be the change is the one on volunteerism. And Where Were You? A Profile of Modern Slavery. I wrote that because everyone is always asking me, can you give me a textbook on human trafficking? And there are textbooks that focus on sex trafficking or forced labor, but I tried to bring it all together. I've been doing this for so long that I was able to give a historical perspective. And so those are the books.
Excellent. You know, what's unfortunate about our education, because not all of us are purposely ignorant. These kinds of topics actually don't happen at the earliest levels of formal education, unfortunately. And as you brought to the forefront, awareness campaigns are even more sparingly produced in most societies. I happen to have a master's degree in international affairs, and that was the first time I was introduced to it. And there's a very small percentage of people who even get a master's. So does that mean the majority of us aren't aware, you know, that these things are happening?
Interestingly, I start training kids in the 5th grade. Now, obviously, we don't talk about sex trafficking. We talk about modern slavery, but 7th, 8th, 9th, 10th, 11th, 12th university here in Hong Kong, we do about 35 presentations a year. We do it all over the world for universities and schools and so forth. And so you know, I totally agree with you. Unless you are getting this information early, you don't know about these topics. I had a 7th grader who heard one of my talks 10 years ago. She came to me afterwards and said, I'm going to do what you do. 10 years later, she was working for the United Nations. The seed was planted, and she was just open to it. We don't pick our causes pick us.
And what also I just want to mention is the fact that the children themselves can't protect themselves if they're not aware that they're at risk. You know, for the child labor and trafficking that takes place, a lot of it happens here. I'm in the United States. It happens everywhere. But a lot of students who feel like they're safe because they're in, you know, a first first level country and they feel like money is flowing. We're not in any danger. It's in the suburbs that a lot of these kids are picked up and transported because they just don't know that there could be a risk. I want to mention, because you didn't say it, but I have some experience with skilled workers also running into what you had said, the contract substitution and similarly debt bondage. As recently as last year here in New York City, we had actually in the Department of Education, there was an article about teachers formerly recruited from the Dominican Republic. And when they arrived, I don't know if you're aware, but for those of you who aren't aware, those teachers were brought in to support the Spanish-speaking population, and they were put in housing that was overpriced. Their passports were held. They were threatened that they would lose they were all on J1 visas, that they would lose their J1 visa status if they mentioned that this was happening to any relatives or the newspaper. But them being educated, they were aware of the fact that they had to tell somebody, otherwise it wouldn't end. So it did finally come out in the paper, but they did have the same exact experience. They came to work, were given a contract. They ended up not being paid what it was that they were told they were going to be paid, and whatever money that came in was paid to the place where they were housed that they didn't agree to. Some people even had their own relatives they could have lived with for free, and they weren't allowed to do that. So I'm saying that because a lot of educators in the Caribbean are taking advantage of opportunities in various countries right now. They're being recruited, and I'm sure that's happening in a lot of places. But the fact is that many of them are reporting, unfortunately, that when they get there, the job they applied for isn't the job they get, and the salary they thought they would receive is also not the salary that they receive. The other thing is that my mom practices immigration, and I was very surprised when I was about 14 years old that guys that had come from Turkey who actually did technical work, they were computer professionals, were being held against their will at a technical company run by Turkish nationals. And, this was under the guise of, oh, you're going to give us all your money because we're doing your immigration papers. And it was through engaging with them that we ended up finding out that they weren't being fed, they were being put in quality housing. I guess what I'm saying this for is that I was so shocked to find out then that professionals were also being subjected to this kinds of treatment, and it's continuing. So I
want to say one more thing about that,
yeah.
just because and I'm sorry to cut into this, but here in Asia, tens of thousands of young professional educated people are being trafficked into scam centers. And this is happening in Cambodia and Myanmar, Nepal, various other locations. This is a new phenomenon. Post-COVID, you had some infrastructure that wasn't being used. They say that there's a job, you'll get $5,000 a month working in Cambodia. When you get there, they bring you to a scam center. If you don't meet your target, you get beaten, tortured, sold to another location. It's a terrible situation. If you haven't started seeing this in the Caribbean and United States and other places, you will, because it's a huge phenomenon. 40% of my time focuses on that now.
Oh my goodness. Well, thank you for sharing that. And thank you for being here. If you could please just stick around. We're going to have some questions later.
I'm looking forward to the next presentation. Yeah.
Yes. So now we are going to be transitioning to our next fabulous speaker, Shira Mansari. She is the founder and CEO of I Am Somebody's Child Soldier. And we are so happy to have you. Welcome. You just need to unmute.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Judy, and thank you very much to your listeners. So I won't necessarily be sharing any slides, just as a way of being able to discuss the charity and the work that I do spend a lot of my time on. So as the CEO and founder of the charity I Am Somebody's Child Soldier, I have spent the last 10 years working with vulnerable children in parts of northern Uganda who have been unfortunately kidnapped and forced into very violent activities. Most of these children have been forced to hold guns. A majority of them have had to kill their family members as a way of showing their loyalty and their commitment to the army commanders. So I'll start off with a story, and this is just one of the many hundreds of stories that I have come across during my time working in this sector. And this is a story of a young girl and a young boy who lived in the same village. And one night, their village was raided by army commanders. And unfortunately, what they were told to do was to shoot their parents. And as they did that, they were really good friends, the boy and the girl. But the fact that they saw each other doing this horrific act meant that they could never look at themselves in the same way ever again. And once they were taken away from that village, they were forced into bushes and they had to walk for a very long time before they finally settled in a camp. During that camp, they were trained on how to clean guns, they were trained on how to shoot, and they were also trained on how to use machetes, which are very brutal instruments that children were being taught to use because some of them weren't as confident using guns. But the interesting fact which I came across was how are these children able to endure a lot of these activities? And one thing stood out for me, it was the fact that they're actually given a lot of drugs that allow them to be able to commit these very graphic acts with not necessarily being able to understand the impact of what they're doing. So we now have a group of children who have been forced to kill their family members, who've been forced into a new country, sometimes new region, but also they've now been forced to consume drugs. And as they're consuming more and more drugs, they become addicted. So fast forward a few years, sometimes even longer, these children are rescued by NGOs within different sections of the charity sector, but also the government in Uganda. And they are given support for the first 6 to 12 months once they're rescued. But unfortunately, what we know is mental health and trauma, especially PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, doesn't necessarily show up within the first 6 to 12 months. And it's usually triggers that allow these children to actually come to grips with the mental health and the trauma that they are enduring. So when we as a charity come in, we focus specifically on the mental trauma and we focus on education. So we have come to understand that with trauma, it's not about putting our Western, I say Western because I happen to be in the United Kingdom and I happen to be doing my PhD on the Western mental health attributes and how they relate to Global South mental health attributes. So our charity really advocates for local ways of understanding trauma, but also of healing trauma and the different modalities that we could use to ensure that children feel comfortable and confident enough to go through that process of healing. We do really understand that children feel very comfortable and safe within an education system, specifically a school, but we're also very aware that a majority of these children have not been able to go to school from a young age. So when they are rescued and they do go into school, it does take them a long time for them to catch up and for them to be able to understand how to progress from an academic and a curriculum level. And I understand that this talk and this podcast usually focuses on education, but what I wanted to really emphasize is that education can come in a number of different ways. And when we're looking at children, it's important to ensure that the education we're providing them really speaks to the level that they're at. So you can see on the screen, thank you very much for sharing the screen, that we've done different programs. We have worked with children who have been amputated or who have lost limbs during the conflict. You can see a picture there. We've also worked with women returnees. These are a group of women who were abducted as young girls and forced into sexual activities with army commanders and actually had children during this conflict. So when they are rescued, some of them are in their teen years, but they now have, 2, 3, even more children that they've had during that time. But they are really passionate about building a future for themselves and their children. So what our charity does is we work with these women to give them skills and to ensure that they have business loans or micro loans to start themselves up with an interest and in a way that they can continue to have an income. It's not necessarily an intervention that we as a charity had set up to do, but it's something that we were told was really important by the caregivers of the children where we work. And the third program is building rehabilitation centers. So this is a program that we've been fundraising and trying to work with a few other corporate partners so that we can actually build a center in northern Uganda where children who are going to schools, or those who aren't necessarily in school can always come and get the PTSD support they need, but also other ways to ensure children are able to reintegrate into community. The key theme there is understanding that education, again, comes in many various forms. So we're not only focusing on the curriculum as it stands, when we look at English or science or maths, we're also focusing on digital literacy and apprenticeships and skills building, because we do understand that the children really want to look forward to the future and they want to be able to maximize a lot of the initiatives and opportunities that the digital age provides. So one of our key programs now is building a rehabilitation centre that doesn't necessarily focus on the physical aspects of a rehabilitation centre, but also looks at it holistically in terms of the materials that we use to build this centre, in terms of the access to lighting, access to green spaces, access to therapeutic spaces, because my research as a PhD student has uncovered that our physical space also triggers PTSD and mental trauma. So if you're in a classroom that has no windows, has only one door, and it's very claustrophobic, that also is a PTSD trigger. So what we are very keen to do as a charity is utilize research, and using both academic research and NGO research to see what is the best way that we can build a rehabilitation centre that focuses on the holistic needs of children. So I'll pause there, and I'm happy to take any questions, but thank you very much for listening.
Well, Shira, that was lovely. Thank you so much. Your program is obviously doing quite a bit. And I just want to scale back a little bit and find out how you entered this work. What motivated you? What is the story behind why you decided that this was something you wanted to pursue the way that you have?
Thank you very much for that question. So I'm originally from northern Uganda, although I was raised in the United Kingdom. And when I first went back to Uganda as a teenager, I was really surprised to see the number of street children and the number of children who were disabled. So when I did some research, I got to understand that a number of these children were former child soldiers, and because they had either killed their parents during the conflict, they were unable to reintegrate into society properly, and it was really challenging for them to find that stability and that caregiving aspect. So based on my legal background, I am a trained lawyer, focusing predominantly on human rights and charity law. I decided to come back to the United Kingdom and set up a charity that could really work on supporting young children, but also focusing more on the mental health and education aspect. So that is how I got involved. And actually, because of the work that I have been doing with the charity over the last 10 years, that is how I decided to go back and do a PhD, so I can really understand what is the best way we can tackle this issue. Because when I think of PTSD and mental trauma that the children endure, especially children who are forced into, child labor, child trafficking, or child soldiers, it's understanding that this is the foundation that they have started with, which is that of trauma, and we need to support them so that they can have a new narrative and a new way of life. And that is what my PhD focuses on.
Excellent. I have another question for you, and I'm going to open up the floor but I have so many.
That's fine.
One of the things that I wanted to ask about is, those of us in the Caribbean know that we have a very, very, I guess you could say, tenuous situation with our young men. And although we haven't labeled it them as child soldiers per se, the phenomenon is similar in the sense that you have older people that are recruiting younger people to participate in some very brutal crime. And so, labels aside, I'd like to know if you could do that for our listeners. What has sparked the issues surrounding the need for child soldiers and how they're being used? What are the political circumstances that has created this phenomenon, and the relationships that they have with the populations that are being used for as child soldiers?
Thank you, Judy. So based on Uganda, I'll speak mostly to that country, but I also have experience of child soldiers in northern Sierra Leone, because of the war that took part in Sierra Leone, although it is quite a few decades ago. But in northern Uganda, we know that the political instability, which arose predominantly due to Connie 2012, there was a really big campaign around that because there was an army commander who wanted to take over power, and the best way he was able to do that was by rallying children because they were, cheap resource at the time, and this was a community and a region that was going through a lot of instability. So because of the instability and because it was a bit further away from the center of Uganda, he was able to get away with kidnapping thousands and thousands of children, and also ensuring that he had their children's loyalty. The children were committing atrocities to villagers and to their own parents and guardians. So I think politically speaking, when I have encountered child soldiers, it is because of the civil wars and insurgencies and other army commanders trying to get power. I can't speak to it in your country, but
of course. No, it's important that we have to understand this is a human condition. And what we're always trying to do is bring those commonalities to the forefront so that we can all have some level of understanding and empathy about the challenges that people are experiencing around the world, because we are those people, and I don't know if you're familiar with Jamaica, but our motto is out of many, one people. And the reason for that is because through England, of course, we had a lot of different people come through. My family is Irish, Chinese, African, and Indian. So, we can literally identify with everybody's plight and work towards it. But the fundamental commonality is that we educate everybody in our network about what you guys are doing so that we ourselves can not only be informed for the sake of being informed, but also so that we can start recognizing these things and seeing them, and where we can help. Be aware that, there are avenues where we can actually lend assistance to people outside of our direct community, but are part of our human community. So I would like to now open the floor to any questions that we have with any viewers that are online. If you just raise your hand, we'd love to hear your comments and support and questions around what has been shared, this amazing information that we have learned about today.
Greetings,
Donovan,
everyone.
you ready? Okay, go ahead.
Judy, how are you?
Good.
All right, Dr. Dices, how you guys doing? Sherry, that was a good statement that you made, but while I was listening to the gentleman before you and your presentation, I came across something that was on the screen that says, the world is a terrible place, not because of those who do evil, but because of those who stand by and don't do nothing, something of that sort. And that is so true. While you were talking, I remember watching the movie, is it The King of Scotland? I think it was, where they talk about Idi Amin and how he had a lot of child soldiers doing a lot of evil things. My question to both you and the gentleman prior to you, aren't there agencies that are out there that are, above these things where they can help the young men and women? If you travel to another country for work, aren't there agencies and, immigration offices that are put in place where they can monitor what happens to you or to the children or to the job people who are giving the jobs to the people? Because it seems like so much corruption is happening that, these child are being put in danger. I mean, NATO, you have Amnesty International. Are they heavily involved, or is it, something that they too themselves might be corrupted? How do we get around that?
Thank you. I don't mind going first, and then I'll pass over to you, Matt. Speaking of Amnesty International, I am a board member of Amnesty International United Kingdom, and I do know that they are doing really impressive work to support children and to advocate for children's rights. However, when I speak of the work and the campaigns happening in Uganda, because it's happening in country, it's not necessarily children being trafficked and brought in country, it's usually locals. So the opportunities there to counteract this and to stop this are quite scarce because they really rely on the political situation in that region at the time. So if there's already instability, it means that the local, government or the local politicians and MPs, there is so much instability and lack of institutionalization of the protection of children that it makes it a very good opportunity for insurgents and army commanders and other civil disobedience mechanisms to unravel. So, that's hopefully answering your question in terms of the internal dynamics. But I imagine from an external dynamics, if children are being brought in, then that's a different situation. And I'll probably pass on to Matthew to speak more about that.
Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just talk a little bit about Bangladesh. I lived there for 5 years. It's a country that has 170 million people living in a country the size of New Jersey. And so you have dire poverty. The average person lives on $3-4 US a day. That supports not only them, but their entire family. And you just have absolute desperation. You have 97% of the people are in dire poverty type situations. And as a result of that, that leads to a lot of people looking for opportunities, a lot of people looking for a better life, a lot of people wanting to go to another location, to the United States, the UK, Australia, and so forth, thinking that they're going to have that better life, not realizing that there's many other people doing the same thing. And as a result of that, these countries are doing everything they can to prevent that from happening. Are there organizations and institutions that address that? Yes, but not enough to really address the need. And I would say relative to my experiences working in over 40 countries around the world is whether it's poverty or girls' education or human trafficking or health issues or anything else, there just isn't enough infrastructure. And that's why I think we as human beings have to kind of figure out what our cause is and step up and be a part of the solution. We can't rely on these institutions to think that they're going to solve it, because we've seen over time that they haven't. But I think as a result of many human beings assuming that it's somebody else's responsibility, they don't do anything. And we have to change that mindset. And that's really an important part of what needs to happen in the next couple of decades in order for us to get out of the hole of all of the things that we need healing on related to this, whether it's the child soldier or human trafficking or migration that goes bad or any of these other topics that we're facing.
Wow, thanks very much. You said something that's very important. I'm here in Jamaica right now, and I have to speak to a couple of young children, especially young men. And not that I'm afraid, but the fact of the matter is the challenges that I might be facing. You said the mindset of people, and I've been preaching that on my radio program over the years, needs to change, especially here in Jamaica and the world too. But at the same time, like Mrs. Dice mentioned, the young men, especially, they're at an age now where it's like, they don't really care anymore because they see the infrastructure of their community, what's happening, the lack of help, and they feel, okay, I'm at an age now where I need to start fending for myself. And these are things that will, of course, affect the younger children because they're seeing this and figure that this is the reason and the means to surviving in these garrisons or ghetto areas. And it makes it harder for people like you guys or even me trying to help. And we're being good citizens, but at the same time, so much, obstacles are in the way, so much opposition are in the way. I mean, how do we go around that? I mean, yes, we know government is corrupted, but if we can find 1 or 2 people on the ground like you guys are doing to make it even better, but they are also facing obstacles. So what other opportunities or choices do we have?
Well, if I could just add, I think
Please.
that you've seen that both Michael and Matthew and Shira have been doing this for a number of years.
Mm-hmm.
It takes a level of commitment. I'm assuming they would agree. Years and years of commitment and reaching out to people individually and getting again to an increase in the campaign around educating our communities about this, that this is happening at a number of levels, and being able to get down to the level of a young man or young woman and explain what the real choices are. A lot of times they don't really see the real extent of the impact and the damage that they're going to do to themselves if they make certain decisions or go down certain roads. But I think nothing can replace our commitment to them. And regardless of what they're going through, the fact that we lend a listening ear to them and give them, that FaceTime and that opportunity to be able to share so that we can help guide them, because they are inundated with so much more information than they ever have been for those of them who do have access, and it can be very confusing and they can make wrong decisions. And as they've mentioned, both of our speakers, is there are a lot of predators out there taking advantage of these young people's being uninformed, being unprotected, and being vulnerable. So there has to be somewhere where they can come and where they can find that safety. And hopefully everybody on this call and everybody who is become aware of this can now become one of those advocates for our kids.
Yeah, I mean, I almost feel like we need a reboot of the way we think about things in the world. It's not working. You know, all the issues that we face, it's not working. And the only way it's going to change is we, the people, take some responsibility. Going back to that quote that you were just referring to, it's because people turn away and don't get involved that they just assume somebody else is going to do it. And there's not enough of us that focus on this and get paid to do this to really make a difference. And so what we really need to do is to kind of early on in a person's life at early school is to instill a sense of responsibility. Identify what is your cause. Your causes will pick you, not the other way around. And once you've identified that, then step up and do something, even if it's just talking to people, teaching people, raising money, volunteering, you know, being a responsible, whatever. That's what's needed now. And, you know, I come to this conclusion after doing this work for over 40 years that if we don't make that change, then we're just going to eventually get to a point where we're not able to address any of these issues. We all have to take some responsibility.
Amen. Thanks.
So we only have about 5 minutes ago. It looks like 4 minutes left for this. We have a few people more online. I invite you to ask any questions that you may have. We have these wealth of knowledge resources available to us. Any burning questions that you have, please come off mute and ask. Dr. Dice, if you have anything. Okay.
Yes, Matt, can you explain a little bit more about ESGs and how people can become involved locally in their community, whether they are in different parts of the world or inner city areas, major cities, and or they can become involved?
I think there's two parts of that. The ESG is what corporations use in order to measure whether they're doing right by the world. And it was used by investors to determine whether they would invest in these companies. But now consumers are looking at ESG scores. So from a community standpoint, as this becomes more prominent, you can go and look at your favorite company and determine whether they're doing right. So from that standpoint, communities can get involved. You know, I mean, I don't know. I wake up every morning realizing that we have 25,000 more people that are entering the world, you know, more child soldiers, more human trafficking or whatever. You know, there are days that I just get very frustrated and, you know, almost depressed by this. But what kind of gets me over that is recognizing that the inherent potential that exists within all of us as individual human beings that's not being used. Yeah, it's being used for your family and your job and so forth. But even if 10% of that could be shifted over to being a part of the solution, you know, just a certain amount of your time. And those of us who do this work realize that, you know, while we do this work, we get paid and everything, but we partly do it because it gives us joy in our heart that we are able to step up and be a part of the solution and help people and so forth. Doing volunteer work and getting involved isn't drudgery. If you pick the right cause, it's in fact something that will add value to your life. The endorphins in your mind will go off. You'll feel good about yourself. You'll find a balance that you didn't have. And so helping people to get over the line and to kind of understand the relevance and the importance of doing things and being a part of causes is a good thing. It's part of what we should be doing as human beings. I think it's part of the human experience. I think we've lost that over time, but we have to get back to that again.
Thank you. We want to stay on time. So Shira, if you don't mind adding your final word, I think what Matthew said is very resonating, and I want to thank you for that comment. But Shira, if you don't mind bringing us to our close. Oh, you're on mute. You came off and then went back on.
You're on mute again.
There we go. Sorry, the screen kept popping to say host has unmuted you. But yes, within the last sort of 60 seconds left, I'll just like to echo Matthew's comments around taking on that responsibility to be the change you wish to see in the world. And had it not been for myself as a sort of young teenager walking through the streets of Uganda and seeing the unraveling situation that children were going through and taking it on myself to do something about it. I don't think I would necessarily be able to speak in this much depth and passion around this issue, but also using your own professional skills. So knowing that I trained as a lawyer, and I could have gone in to do commercial or corporate law, but I chose to do the law that's going to help make a difference within the area or the cause that I'm really passionate about, which is children and children's rights. So my sort of last 2 cents on this is to be the change you wish to see, and to be committed to the cause that you decide to embark on, because in the end you will make a difference, even if it's to one person or 100. That does make a huge difference.
Excellent. Well, it has been a pleasure to have both of you. Thank you so much for taking the time out today to join us and share your wealth of knowledge. It has really, really been a pleasure for myself, and I believe for everybody who's joined us. So thank you for that. Dr. Dice, if you wanted to round us out with the final word.
I wasn't expecting, I thought you were gonna close, but I personally, I'm happy for the opportunity to thank them, because these two wonderful people are two of my special people who are doing wonderful work out there in various continents, so it's really awesome. And the work is very sad that we have to do this work. It's very, very sad, but it's purposeful work. So on the one hand, we have to do it, and then because nobody else is stepping up, or a few other people stepping up. And then on the other hand, it's burdensome that we have to work against other human beings to take care of human beings. It's really sad on that part. But I'm very privileged to be among this group who are making waves in a positive way, who are trying desperately to leave the world better than how they see it right now. So thank you so much. And of course, we're partnering forever in this cause to see if we can create a better world.
Thank you very much.
Those of you who joined us, please look into the resources that we've put on the chat, so you can learn more about Shira and Matthew and the work that they're doing, and you can participate in the solution. And for those of you who enjoyed this, and if you haven't already subscribed, please go on to educationsolutionsinternational.org, subscribe. I've dropped in the chat, of course, our YouTube channel. This video will be available. Please share widely this information with your peers and your friends and your family. We really need to do something about getting that information out there about these challenges and about the solutions and those great people that are doing it. And if you want more programming like this, please look out for our notifications for all the other different wonderful workshops and programs and forums and training sessions that we have for teachers, and all of those different leadership opportunities that we try to make available to our network. So thank you again. Wishing everyone here a wonderful and safe day, and we look forward to seeing you again. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.